Welcome back to Everyday Economics, the podcast that helps you learn about the economic world happening around you every day. I'm your host, Chris Krug, president of 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan Franklin News Foundation. Everyday Economics, a production of America's Talking Network. You can subscribe to all of our podcasts at americastalking.com. To support Everyday Economics, make your tax-deductible charitable contribution by clicking the link in the show description. We're recording today's episode on Friday, January 5th. Joining me, as always, my partner, Dr. Orphe Divounguy, PhD economist. Dr. O, I want to hop right into it and talk to you about one of my favorite subjects, out-migration. It's always interesting to see, and in-migration also. Of course, I live in the state of Illinois, so I've sort of been trained on some level to think about out-migration, people leaving the state. But people actually who leave the state, they have to go somewhere else. And the vast majority of Americans don't leave the United States, even when they threaten to move to Canada for presidential outcomes and things of that nature. They move to other states. So United Van Lines, and U-Haul does this too, but the United Van Lines national study came out, and basically what they do is they track, where their vans go, and they offer up data that gives you an insight as to where people are going and where they are coming from. And the out-migration list, the places where people are moving out of, it's kind of like, I hate to call it a broken record, but it's largely a lot of the same states, and the vast majority of them are blue states, and they're states that have issues with pension debts and cost of living is high. They've got issues with crime, they've got issues with poverty, they've got issues with jobs and job creation. The top 8 outbound states in the United Van Lines survey for 2023: number 1, New Jersey; number 2, Illinois; number 3, North Dakota. We could talk about that. I think that's largely driven by, lack of opportunity around the energy industry. New York State, Michigan, California, Massachusetts, and Kansas. And I have not studied, sort of like Kansas out-migration. Hasn't been on my radar, but apparently out-migration in Kansas has been an issue. So where are the people moving to, according to United Van Lines? Take a look at this list, and you explain to me what exactly is going on here, because this is an interesting array, and these are not states that you would necessarily think would be on the top of this list. Number 1 being Vermont, which I find to be very interesting.
Totally. So that you have to understand something about the United Van Lines, and I know because I was somewhat involved in looking at their data, their migration data, is that this represents their customer base, and their customer base skews higher income and older, not representative of all movers across the United States. All right. So that's the first thing. But when I looked at their data, what I learned is that regardless of these, top destinations by total row flows of migrant flows, mover flows, if you look at the ratio of inbounds to outbounds, in other words, net migration, if you look at net migration, what you learn is that movers were essentially relocating to less expensive metros with less competition in the housing market. And those places with the most positive net migration were Charlotte, North Carolina, Indianapolis, Indiana, and a couple others like Raleigh, North Carolina. So a couple of these markets, Nashville, Tennessee, a couple of these markets where, if you take a look at migration flows in 2022 from the official U.S. Census Bureau or American Community Survey, well, these places kind of match what we kind of already knew. You have these hot metro areas, or at least they're getting hotter, that are still somewhat affordable despite, right? So relatively affordable, that have a lot of upside potential. And so, the upside potential comes from the fact that people are moving to those places that are relatively more affordable and that are nicer, I guess. You think about the weather, they tend to be south. There are also places where there's a greater mix of housing being built, right? And so they offer more options for people. And so that's essentially what's interesting is even though this survey is only basically United Van Lines consumers, it still tells a story. It paints a story that's consistent with what the official migration numbers also portray. Another thing that I learned from looking at the data is that those places with the highest net migrant flows also tend to see a stronger home value growth, right? Stronger increases in home values in the year that follows the survey. And so I expect those markets to really outperform, at least in terms of seeing home values increase in those markets in 2024 relative to the rest of the country.
So let me run through the places where people were moving to, just so that we're sort of complete and putting it together. I said Vermont was number 1. Washington, D.C. was 2, and you said that the United Van Lines clientele skews older. Those are probably people that are exclusively in the U.S. Senate.
Older, higher income. Older, higher income. That's a good one. No, for sure. For sure. I mean, you have a lot of people who move to the DC area. DC is kind of separate. It's kind of unique in the sense that it's a massive government hub, government employer, right?
And it's very interesting, though, that shows up. South Carolina was 3rd, Arkansas 4th, Rhode Island 5th, which I found to be kind of an unusual one. But you've talked about Providence kind of being in particular on the upswing.
If you look at net migration, then you have Charlotte, Providence, Indianapolis, Orlando, and Raleigh, North Carolina at the top. Charlotte and Raleigh both in a very close proximity of each other, which is very, very interesting. You know, if you've been paying attention, you know there's a big tech hub in that, you know, it's kind of the tech hub of the East Coast.
Yeah, it's the triangle. It's terrific, and it's a beautiful part of the country. You said North Carolina, so North Carolina and Raleigh and Charlotte have largely driven that, the increases there. South Dakota, Governor Kristi Noem, I see ads in my local market here in Chicago for, come live and work in South Dakota all the time. Alabama, New Mexico, and West Virginia. And, New Mexico and West Virginia aren't necessarily, and Alabama also, I wouldn't say that they're necessarily, garden spots, which makes it very interesting. But I think that one thing that the 3 of those states, and actually include South Dakota in there as well, those 4 states, South Dakota, Alabama, New Mexico, and West Virginia, you do have a lower cost of living there. And so this would be probably keying in on some level to older people and people who are maybe looking to retire. Retiring to South Dakota, not so sure about that, but, I don't know. Interesting list. Any final thoughts on this, Dr. O?
No, you just have to know, you have to pay attention, right? Especially if you're like a real estate investor, where people are moving should be the number one thing I look at. And that data is suggestive that, if you own property in some of these markets that we mentioned on the show, you're going to be okay. You're going to do really well in 2024, as opposed to people who are in markets that are shedding people very rapidly.
Always great to spend time with you. Thanks so much for the insights. For Dr. Orphe Divounguy, this has been Chris Krug. Subscribe to Everyday Economics and dozens of other quality podcasts at americastalking.com.